So, guten Morgen. Ich hoffe, Sie hatten einen schönen Abend gestern Abend,
Good
hatten eine
morning.
gute Nacht.
I hope you had a great evening last night and also got a good night's sleep. It's great that so many of you are here already this morning. We have 2 more presentations this morning, and we also have another guest, one of our kids. We're just waiting for David. Okay. Yes, as I said, we have another guest here, a kid with charge, who's going to announce the next speech. Hi. Hi, I'm Jonas. My name is Jonas. I'm 12 years old. And I'm going to be in 5th grade. 5th grade, 4B. And the next speakers will be David and Julie. Danke.
Oh no. Good morning again. You only have me for a short time this morning, I promise. Most of this presentation Julie will be making, but I will do a little bit at the beginning and a bit at the end. There is no other charge conference where I am introduced in such a wonderful way as the German conference. It's always spectacular to be introduced like this. Usually they talk about my education and which university I went to and all that kind of stuff. I like it this way, it's much more interesting. For me, it's a great pleasure to be here with Julie. I've known Julie a long time in California, but only in the last few years have we worked together more. And when I retired 18 months ago, Julie took my job. It was just perfect. We were worrying about what would happen to my job, and Julie was there and was interested and was available. And people have said to me, oh, when you retire, are you worried about your job? Will you worry about the children? And I said, no, because we have the most perfect person to step in and not just do the job well, but do it in a slightly different way with more energy than me and more ideas, I think, wider ideas than mine. As Rob says, I have a bit of an obsession about things. Julie has far fewer obsessions and a broader view of the children. I'm all the time looking at their feet and their shoulders, and she's looking at the whole child. Just a little bit of background. The title of this talk comes from a situation I was in England many, many years ago. There was a school psychologist who worked in a school district who was a very arrogant, difficult personality. And I went to a meeting about a child with charge, and the school psychologist thought she was the boss, the dictator of everybody. And she and I had a bit of a fight because she was saying things which were completely wrong about the child. And she was so upset that she stopped the meeting and we all had to go home. And then 2 years later, I went to another meeting about a different child, and the same psychologist walked into the room. And I thought, bad words, I thought, oh no, oh God, it's her. And she smiled at me, and then as an insult, she said, oh, you're the man who always looks at the children through rose-colored glasses. what she meant was, you are not honest about the children, you don't see them clearly, because you have a stupid idea where you don't see the problems, you only see the positive things. And I've always been grateful to her for giving me that phrase, because I'm very proud that I'm the man who looks at the children through rose-colored glasses. And actually, all the presenters at this conference look at children through rose-colored glasses. We're all more interested in what the children do and what they can do and their achievements than we are in the problems. We're aware of the problems, but we know that the way forwards is to focus on the positive things. So that's where the talk comes from. The idea for this came from 2 articles. Julie and I did not collaborate, but we wrote 2 articles 2 years ago now. And they came out in the same edition of our newsletter at California Deafblind Services. Mine was called What Does Follow the Child Mean, which I think has been in Trommelwirbel, I think. I can't remember now. Or it might be in there. And then Julie's article. And it was Julie's idea to put these 2 things together and come up with a presentation, which we gave in Chicago 12 months ago. And at the end of the presentation, Julia Bentz and Claudia Junghans came up. They came up towards me, and I was smiling at them, and they walked right past me and over to Julie. It was just fantastic. And they said, will you do that in Germany next year? And that's why Julie is here.
Can I say something? So David's right. The reason I thought originally when I asked David, and I had not known at that time that he doesn't usually co-present with people, so it was maybe very bold of me to suggest that I present with him at the International Charge Conference, but he said yes. But part of why I think they fit well together is I think David's Follow the Child assessment process is wonderful and perfect and simple. And the way David describes it is simple, but for a lot of people who aren't used to assessing kids in that way, it's not simple unless you kind of shift your mindset and your perspective of how you look at the children. So that's what my article was about, and that's why I thought they went together well. And yes, I was thrilled when Julia and Claudia pushed David aside and invited me to come here. Okay.
I think it's very good for experts to be pushed aside for somebody else. It's a good reminder that we're all human, and there are lots of us involved trying to find the answers to these very complicated children. And I talked about this yesterday, so I won't say too much, but because so much of my life is around charge syndrome, I forget how unique it is and sometimes how complicated it is. I look at children here in the cafeteria and I'm not surprised and I feel I understand a lot. But outside of this little world, these children are very strange to people, and we meet that all the time. But it's important to keep remembering that. And also, there's an additional problem, which is that the population has changed so much. And I also said this yesterday, so that we're now seeing children who are much more complicated and much more medically involved. Oh, we've got slides I wasn't expecting, Julie. Which is what I was just saying. And as the complexity has increased, as the medical issues have increased in number and severity, assessment has become more and more difficult. And any kind of standard approach to assessment becomes less and less appropriate. Yeah, we have lots of slides in here which we weren't going to use. I'm sorry.
You used these yesterday.
Oh, dear. So, problems with the assessment process. First of all, that the population is very diverse. Oh, and now we've jumped out of the slideshow. Oh, well. And now it's telling me I have a Google software update, which I really don't want at the moment, because it's not a convenient time for doing that. Google should know that. It's supposed to be able to do everything. Don't you find it constantly goes wrong and there are problems? But when you talk to those people in San Francisco, they think it's your fault always. That's another topic. First of all, the population is very diverse. And as I also said this yesterday, if people have met one person with charge, they think everybody with charge is exactly the same. And we know that that isn't necessarily the case. There are a whole range of idiosyncratic behaviors. And I talked yesterday about posture and movement, but there are other kinds of idiosyncratic behaviors as well. And they are misunderstood and misinterpreted. And the words autistic, the words obsessive compulsive disorder, the words lazy and resistant are often used and are usually used inappropriately. It's because people don't understand why the children are doing the things they do, that they fall back on these labels, because they can't deal with individuals, they can only deal with labels and categories. So the first goal of the assessment is to put the child in a category rather than get to know who the individual is. It's a very common problem. People doing the assessments usually only know one type of assessment process. And when I say assessment, people often think it's a book or a binder or a DVD or a computer program. And they say to me, I will see a child and they will say, could I have a look at your assessment materials? And I say, well, it's my book, it's my notebook and my pen. And I observe and I do the assessment. And then they come back and they say, yes, but I'd like to see your assessment materials. And we go in this circular conversation because for them, there can't be any assessment unless you have an assessment material. And it's usually something you buy. You have to pay money for it. And they want it from me so that they can go and do the assessment. What they don't want to hear is you observe the child and see what's happening. And that is a big battle because many professionals have to use a particular assessment material. Their job gives them that obligation. And I find myself constantly saying, in which case you will fail and then the child will fail because you have to leave that behind and look at them. There is no substitute. And it's not acceptable for you to use the wrong assessment materials and then produce results on the child because the child will always suffer. There are also limited resources and assessment tools available. It's a constant search to find where are the good assessment tools and assessment materials. I'm not saying all those things are bad. In fact, I learned a lot from certain assessment tools back in the past. Occasionally, I still look at some of those assessment materials to help to remind me of things or to give me other ideas. But ultimately, whichever materials you use, at some point you have to put them down and start to observe the child without the materials, because the materials come between you and the child and they block things so you don't see them. And you end up assessing the wrong things and not seeing the right things. And again, that's very, very common. Oops, wrong computer. And I think Julie and I agree, the biggest problem of all is that people, when they do assessments, forget the reason why. Why are we assessing this child? And usually the reason why in their mind is a very quick, very short-term, practical, organizational challenge. It isn't about getting to know the child. It isn't about getting to understand the child. It's about going through a bureaucratic procedure so that at some point you can put a check in a box and you say, I've done it. I can close the file. We've now assessed the child. So reminding people of the true function of assessment in an educational and developmental setting is a task that we have to keep reminding ourselves of. And now Julie will take over.
Good morning. I'm very happy to be here. I'm really very excited, very honored to be asked here. And so I wanted to once again thank Claudia and Julia and everyone that's running this fantastic program for asking me here and giving me the opportunity to share my ideas. And I wanted to thank one other group that's here today. I really wanted to thank all the teachers and educators that took time to come here today, that are showing an interest in thinking about a different way to assess children, to work with children. You have very, very difficult jobs. I was a teacher for a long time before I started doing teacher training and now working with the Deaf Blind Project in California. And it's a hard job. David and I are going to talk to you a lot about looking at individual children. And I just want to let you know that we're also well aware that we're asking you to look at individual children while you also work in a classroom with many children and many other adults that you're managing. And so we hope that what we're able to share with you today will be something that's inspirational, perhaps, but most of all will be very helpful for you. And I think the things that we'll say are not things that you can just walk out the door, perhaps, and do right away, but I hope that you just want to keep thinking about it and keep reflecting about your own practice and how it matches up with what the things that we're saying. So anyways, I'm glad that when we were in Chicago last year, I would say most of the audience that we were speaking to were families, which is wonderful. We love working with families. And a lot of people came up to us besides Claudia and Julia at the end and said, I have never heard my child's teacher say that, or that isn't the way that they're doing things at my child's school or in my child's district. And so it's, for me, very important that this information is actually getting out to the people that are in the classrooms with the children. And the other thing I wanted to say before I got started, is that I think this approach that we're going to talk about is really thinking about the individual child. And if you do the assessment right, what it should do at the end is help you identify what would be the right supports for that child or what would be the right types of accommodations. So this isn't about we're only going to look at the child and only see the positives and only the strengths, that whole idea of the rose-colored glasses, or I'm often, and I love this label, I'm often told is I'm the girl that always sees the glass as half full. If you see a glass and someone will say, well, that's a half empty glass, I always see it as half full. There's a lot of potential there. But I think this perspective or this mindset, what it helps you do is it helps you identify what might work. So if a child can, I was talking with Julia the other day in the car, her daughter Lavinia knows a lot of information from her classes. And if you give her a test where all the choices are either up in a word bank or in a multiple choice, she can tell you everything she learned from that chapter. But if you give her a piece of paper and say, write a 3-paragraph essay about that, she won't be successful. And you can't do that and then say, this child doesn't know the material. She absolutely knows it. You just have to find the right way that she can demonstrate that. Okay. So I'm ready to get started. So we have typical purposes of assessment. So assessment, as David said, is something that needs to occur. And ideally what it will do is it will let you know where the child's at. So it will provide that baseline of what the child's current skills are, what knowledge they already have, what experiences they've had. And if you've, again, done a thorough one, you'll find out a lot about the child. Many schools and districts, at least in the United States, and I'm sure here, you have to initially have an assessment just so they can say, yes, you need these services. You need this specialized instruction. A good assessment will help you identify, as I said earlier, the right kind of supports, accommodations. And ideally what it will do is it will provide a roadmap for intervention. It will set you on a course for a plan so that the child can learn even more things. And then finally, assessments are then done annually or on a regular basis so that you can check a child's progress. Now, the problem that David and I have seen in schools with assessment is the things he listed before, the limited numbers, the one kind of assessment, the forgetting why. But I also think that lots of times, and this, again, I know has to do with bureaucracy, it has to do with limited resources. I know certainly in the state that we're in California, very limited resources in terms of not having enough people and services and types of services that all kids need, that they do the assessment and then they fit the child into the program. And sometimes they come to the assessment, as David mentioned, before they even start the assessment, they have an idea. Well, this child has CHARGE syndrome and cannot speak yet and doesn't know his numbers, so he's going to go into the class for children with intellectual disabilities, or what some people might say mental retardation. Or this child has autism and has these types of support needs and can't do these things, so we're going to put him in the autism class. So before they even start the assessment, they've got this idea that we need to do the assessment so we can fit the kid into the program, and that isn't what assessment should do. Assessment should help you find the information you need so that then you can make the program fit the child. All right, just a moment. So we're offering a different approach. So you're still building that learning profile of the child. You're trying to get the baseline, understand what the child knows, what the child can do, what the child does, as David talked about yesterday, just what do they do when no one's around. And you really, what we tend to focus on is let's look at what skills do they have and what are their interests. So Rob talked a lot about that yesterday. You know, really find out what is a child passionate about. And if a child's passionate about trains, or a child's passionate about minions or Pokemon, use those types of interests to see if you can find out the other skills that they have. And you really need to focus on that individual child and not make them fit to this normative standard. So that often is what doesn't fit for a lot of the children we work with who are deafblind and who have CHARGE. It doesn't fit to just take that standardized assessment off the bookshelf and fill it out, because we already know that their learning profile is not probably going to match their same age peers. It's not going to give you information that will be helpful in terms of building a program. It would be much more helpful to know actually what math facts or what words or what things interest and make that child passionate than knowing that they can't do all these things that the other 8-year-old or 12-year-old could do. And then I've just been at too many meetings where families year after year have to sit at that meeting and hear someone tell them once again that their child's developmental level or their intellectual level matches that of a much, much younger child. The people that are most aware that their child is not exactly like their peers in terms of their development and their intellect are the parents. And they don't have to be told that again at another meeting with all this language and numbers that and standardized deviations that don't make sense. So you can still, but you don't forget about the child's needs. We're not saying you only look at what the child can do, what skills they have, what interests. You also have to look at what do they need, but you're going to really focus on then not what's wrong with that child, but what are the supports that would help that child be able to do the things that they already can do or that they want to learn to do. And you're really, this is key, this last point, is you're really going to expect that the child has intelligence, and you're really going to expect that that child wants to communicate, that that child has skills, some of the adaptive skills that David talked about in terms of movement and posture yesterday, that all of those things, you're going to expect that you're going to see those things, that the children know what they need and what they can do, and that they have potential. If you show up at the assessment process and you expect that the child isn't going to pass this test, or I don't think they're going to get very far, we'll probably just get through the first sections, then I really think you're not going to find out the information you need that will help you figure out what would support the child in the classroom. So I suggested in the article that we showed earlier is you use an approach called a capacity building approach. And so this framework is really thinking more about, let's look at, again, that glass, and there's liquid in it that goes up to the middle part of the glass, and we're going to say, oh my gosh, I have a half full glass of water. We're not going to say, oh, what happened to the rest of that water? How are we going to fill that cup up, okay? We have a half full glass of water. And so you're really looking at, and you're, again, remember, you're expecting that you're going to see something. And some of these children, as David talked about, and as many of you know from working with them, and those of you that are parents living with them and raising them, is some of these kids, it's not easy always to find those things. So you're really going to expect that you're going to see a child that can learn, that wants to learn, wants to share things with you, wants to communicate. So you're going to look for and recognize unique characteristics, talents, interests of that person. And you're really going to assume that this person is competent. So again, we're not going to walk in and say, oh, I've seen that kind of kid before. I know exactly what that kid needs. I know exactly the kind of program that child has to go to. So you're going to assume competence, and you're really going to value ways that they would be able to participate and contribute in their own unique way. This capacity building approach is really focused on looking at a child's potential, right, and what their capabilities are. We spend a lot of time, and sometimes it's easier for us because a lot of these kids communicate, act or behave, interact with people, or leave situations in ways that are not typical. They're not the ways that we expect. So those are the things that tend to kind of pop out and be highlighted. And just generally in society, the things that people notice. They notice the things that are different. So what we're asking, or what we're suggesting, is that you look past that and know that there's something else there that's going to show you all kinds of ways that that child could participate, could learn, and could communicate with you. So the capacity building process is very individualized. You're not going to meet any one child that's the same. And from as you finish that assessment process, you're going to come up with a plan or a roadmap for that intervention that's very individualized and will fit that particular kid. Okay? So the assessment process that is typically more traditional, or that you see, is this deficit framing framework. So, and the deficit framing framework is one that you might be familiar with. It's one that's very focused on what those benchmarks or those standards that a child can reach, and then they can't get past, so we know they're there, and that's where we'll start. So it's very focused on identifying limitations, perhaps, or barriers. Lots of times it's focused on labels. So we might even use a certain book because a child already has that label. So the label, the things that the child cannot do yet, or hasn't demonstrated yet, and the fact that perhaps they are not someone that communicates verbally, or is not yet at a certain grade level understanding of curriculum, will is a thing that people focus on, and then that's what the program, or the type of the type of intervention that they will use for that child. So it's very focused on that, and it's focused on fixing and remediation. It's that idea of like, okay, this is where you're at, and this is what you're supposed to look like for a 9-year-old. And so these are the things that we're going to focus on, and we're going to get you ready. And once you're ready, once we fix that, then you can go be with the typical population. So it's not really focused on potential. It's really thinking about, we've got to get you ready, we're going to fix you, and meeting that certain criteria. And it can be very, very limiting. And another thing, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, is the view of supports. Oftentimes the fact that someone needs supports, that someone needs a sign language interpreter or an intervener, that someone needs to use an augmentative communication device to speak for them, or needs adapted curriculum, that's actually used as evidence of what's wrong with the child. That's the problem. Rather than realizing that supports is what you should be thinking about as something that is going to help the child, and realizing that all of us rely on supports in our everyday life. So this next slide this is kind of the crux of my argument in this article, and what I was thinking about is, if you use a capacity building framework rather than a deficit finding framework, so again, that more traditional assessment approach that we're used to, like, all right, let's discover what the child can't do yet, and then we'll fix that. If you use capacity building, you're actually changing the position of the child altogether, because when you're looking at that deficit framing framework, you're very focused on the child is the problem, or the things that the child can't do, that's the problem. And with a capacity building approach, you're assuming the child can do all sorts of things. You just have to observe and look hard enough for it, or imagine what that child can do. I think last night listening to Florian and his mother was a really good example of, probably from a very young age, Florian's parents really had this imagination and this vision for what his life could look like. And then really it sounded like, from how they talked about it, took a very kind of person-centered approach to, as he got older, helping him to be involved in that, to the point that, you know, he's living the kind of life that he wants to live now, a very high quality life. So if you can move away from that the child's the problem, and think about, actually, the problem is, I said on this slide, the educational professionals, but it could be in any situation. It could also be if things are not working quite right within the family. You have to really kind of shift that perspective to, okay, what haven't I tried already? Or what's missing? Or what if we tried this support? Or it doesn't seem like these accommodations are working anymore. So we're not going to say, oh, he can't do it, and we've tried, we adapted the material, he still can't do it. Or she can't, answer the questions on that science test because she only wrote 2 sentences, versus writing out the questions and providing choices and a word bank so that she could actually demonstrate that. So if you really can shift it to, and I put this image up of the person looking in the mirror, so if we can stop seeing the kids as the problem, and start realizing, like, we're not the problem either. I'm not saying educators are the problem, but the problem is there, and we have to look in the mirror and say, okay, why didn't that work? And it didn't work because the child's stubborn, or the child can't learn, or the child doesn't want to make friends. It's because we haven't figured out the right supports, or the right way to instruct that child, or the right materials to engage that child and make them interested. All right? So I was talking about earlier, really presuming competence and thinking about the assumption when you meet a child and you start to do this process and you start to observe, that you're assuming that you're going to see a person that wants to connect with another person, is trying to communicate something, and it might be, again, communicating it in a very atypical way, is trying very hard to make sure that they can use their vision, so they're going to go and put their head down on the desk, and that doesn't mean that they're resistant and that they're bored. It just means they can't see the book when you make them go like this. So we're going to presume competence. And I think it would be very hard to use the follow the child assessment process that David speaks about if you're not going to expect that you're going to see something, and again, that you're going to see that half full glass, or you're going to forget to bring your rose-colored glasses that day. Oh, hang on 1 second. This is complicated doing it with 2 slides, two computers. I should have practiced. All right. Oh, and I also realized one thing. I skipped this one? Oh, yeah, we do. That's the one, all right. So an example that I shared last year in Chicago and I talked about in my article is, and again, not saying that every child who's deafblind is Helen Keller. We know that she was quite unique. But if we really think about this idea of competence, I think you have to think back to one of those early interveners, or probably the most famous intervener we can think of, Annie Sullivan. And when she was asked to come help when the Keller family was feeling quite desperate about their daughter, and I want to also check, does everyone in the audience know who Helen Keller is? I want to just make sure. Okay. So I wrote, let's consider the first few weeks Annie Sullivan spent with the young Helen Keller. What if she had only recognized a wild child who held no desire to communicate with others or potential to learn? What if she believed that Helen was only a spoiled child with a bad temperament that would be permanently locked inside herself because she had lost her vision and hearing as a baby? Well, fortunately for Helen and her family and society as a whole, Miss Sullivan took the approach of presuming competence. And she understood that Helen's different behaviors, actions were certainly a form of communication and an indication of a deep desire to know and to learn and to grow. So I think it's important to remember that Helen, at a very, very young age, she seemed ineducable to people. And the Kellers were really at the end of their rope. They were ready to, they couldn't get her in schools, they couldn't manage her in their household, they didn't know how to communicate with their child. And you still hear things like that today. You still hear people say, you know, he can't communicate, he can't learn. You hear, you know, families being told you're just spoiling that child at home, or he's just, you know, he's not a good kid. And I just think you've really got to look past that, especially with these children that are really, they don't have a way to kind of connect. They're locked inside themselves, and they need that way to connect with people and to communicate and have a way to learn. And we've got to keep looking. And Annie Sullivan just kept looking. She just kept looking for a way in. Five years ago, I was in California, and I was asked to go, when I was a teacher in California, I'll go back a little bit, 25 years ago, I was an inclusion support teacher, so I worked in general classrooms with kids who had different types of disabilities. Two of them were children who were deafblind, but then there were other kids who had intellectual disabilities or physical disabilities, and I worked in classrooms to help the teachers in those classes and the assistants or aides in those classes put together a program for the kids, and I also worked in the classroom with the children. And so I still sometimes go out and help families who are trying to get their kids put into programs where they can be with their typical peers, where they can be with the general ed population, kids without disabilities. And in California and in many places in the United States, and I know many places in Europe and around the world, there's still a lot of segregation, where because you have a disability, it's thought you would best learn in a different school or a smaller class with other students with disabilities. So I met this family and this child had intellectual disabilities. He did not have CHARGE syndrome. He had Down syndrome. And what was interesting is I went down to see this child, and I couldn't believe, and this was really not just my rose-colored glasses and the glass half full. This child was really, really smart. He knew a lot. He was reading already, and he had been taught that mostly at home and with some outside tutoring, not because his classroom had no literacy curriculum. He just figured out routines really quickly. He could get around the classroom. He was the whole school campus. He was very, very independent. And so I saw this kid, and he did not match at all with the reports I was hearing from the school team about what he could do, because all they were focused on were telling me all these things that he wasn't doing yet, but they weren't looking at what he was doing. And so this example that I'm showing here was, and this is when I thought about this phrase of a deficit framing versus a capacity building model, is I realized they couldn't see anything besides his deficits. And then I was coming in and I was just seeing all his potential and capacity, and I couldn't figure out how to match it. And so one example that I show here is they showed me this assessment that they did. So they used it was environmental signs. So he was supposed to be looking at signs, things that said exit or stop or men's room. So they gave him this, and what they said is, while Juan was expressively able to identify many of the signs by category, it's the opinion of the examiner, so again, this very kind of formal expert language, that Juan's responses were often not specific to the function of the sign in a context. And examples he included, he says, while what Mr. P does, that was his general ed teacher, 6th grade teacher, for recycling, and when he saw the slippery when wet sign, he said, you might fall. This indicates that he is able to rely on visual cues, yet he may have difficulty when found in the natural environment, such as buildings and outdoor settings. So this was the reason why this child shouldn't go into the 6th grade, okay? This was one of the reasons. There were other reports, but this was just one clip of it. But when I look at that, so that's very deficit framing. That's saying what Juan cannot do. But I can look at that same piece of information. So I'm not going to tell you anything different about his performance. But if you look at that same piece of information, we know that Juan does well with visual materials, right? And he has a strong memory because he remembers things he learned. Okay, so that's great. We know this about Juan now. This is good. We can do something. He can make inferences and associations. So he did not say recycling when he saw the recycling sign. But what he said is what Mr. P does. So he knows where people are recycling. I mean, he's absolutely showing that he knows the meaning of the symbol and the context for it. He can predict events and problems and assess the risk. So again, he did not say slippery when wet, but he said you might fall. So isn't that showing you how smart this kid is? He's not going to read the sign, but he's going to say, oh, I'm going to walk around, right? He's very, very smart. And then they say he might not know these things if he sees them outside of the classroom and not on the flashcard. Well, if you're using the capacity building approach, you make sure you teach those things in natural environments. So give him more opportunities to be outside of the classroom doing these things. So this is as simple as it is. That's as simple as the mind shift. It's the same material, it's the same kid, but you can look at what the findings were in a different way. And I have to speed up, I can tell. I don't know if some of you have heard of this phrase before, the criterion of the least dangerous assumption. Have any people heard of this idea? Okay, a few. It was Anne Donnellan came up with this phrase in the 80s, and she's someone that's worked a lot with children with autism and other intellectual disabilities and students who have complex communication needs. And what she wrote is, and this is really important, that we should really be making all of our educational plans and decisions based on this question, this criterion. The criterion of the least dangerous assumption holds that in the absence of conclusive evidence, educational decisions ought to be based on assumptions which, if incorrect, will have the least dangerous effect on the likelihood that the students will be able to function independently as adults. So I want to unpack that for you a little bit more. It basically means that the educational decisions you make about kids, they might not always be right. But you want to make sure that they do the least harm to the child in the end. So a very basic one could be, we could just assume that every child that has CHARGE syndrome needs to be in a special school or in a special class or only around other children that communicate at the same level. But that may mean that the child doesn't have models, other people that can demonstrate how to communicate, may not be able to form friendships with kids who are different than them, may not have access to the same general ed curriculum. Now, if we put them in a different kind of setting, so they're getting some access to the general curriculum, they're meeting other friends, they're around people that speak, they might not learn everything in that general ed curriculum. They might not learn to speak like the other kids. They might not make as many friends as the other kids there, but at least they had that opportunity. So that would be less harmful to the child, the fact that they had those opportunities versus like, we know they won't do those things if they never have the opportunity. So an example that I show here is, let's think about two different cases and it's the same child, all right? So in the first case, the child with CHARGE syndrome, and she has significant vision losses and she has a profound hearing loss, and they've provided her with an object calendar. They're teaching her signed communication, some basic literacy, as well as functional math skills, so she's learning to count, use money, and the use of a white cane early in her school years. She's provided with daily integration, so she's with general ed kids every day, and she's taught how to communicate and engage, and we teach them how to communicate with her and play with her. And she receives support from an intervener, and her team regularly meets to discuss her progress and support needs. In case number 2, it's the same child. This time she's in a special ed class. She receives primarily custodial care, so they're taking care of her. They're giving her snack, they're taking her to the bathroom. And there's no academic instruction or communication system because she's not really aware of anything or anyone around her. She's not showing interest in other people. This is the same kid again, okay? And an the academic curriculum would be too hard because she's too delayed. We know that already, so we're just gonna take care of her. She must be led around by the hand by different people to different activities because she can't see. So we're not gonna use the white cane because we're not sure she can use a white cane. And she can't hear, so it's not safe for her to use that cane yet. So when she's ready, we're gonna do that, right? And she plays alone by choice and because she's just not interested in her peers. Now I asked you the question, which assumption is more dangerous to follow? What is going to do more harm to this child? Case 1 or case 2? You can show me with your fingers, yeah. Okay, I can't promise you that this child in case 1 is going to learn to use a cane independently. I can't promise you that she's going to learn to communicate, but I can promise you that she's going to have an object calendar, which we're going to hear about this afternoon from Tim or Nancy, how important those are. She's going to learn something about books and literacy. She's going to know how to count, something. She might not get to really a high level, but we know she absolutely won't with case number 2, so that's more dangerous to follow. Oh, I've done this again. I've got to stop clicking that slide. Okay. Am I showing this one, David, right now? No. Oh yeah, so it's the same view, it's a different perspective. So again, it's shifting that focus of the child. So the lens is not limited to identifying only the strengths, but it rather just shifts that focus. So you're still looking at the child, but you're looking at them in a different way. It's looking at what the child's doing by you're looking beyond what the child's doing by describing what's different or missing. And you're instead considering, why isn't this child doing something? Or why is this child doing something? And then you identify those supports. It's important that you think about what supports are needed that would help the child. So these educators also understand that the problems that most challenge them are actually evidence of the child's capability. So a child whose behavior is really a challenge to you, or is it you feel like it's a problem, that's actually something that's showing you the child is trying to tell you something, or the child can do something, but you're not giving them the right way. Another key thing about this framework that that I'm talking about is this idea of support needs, and I mentioned this earlier, but often a deficit framing view really judges the type and intensity of support. So if a child needs an intervener, a one-on-one intervener, or needs a lot of service providers, that's another way that people say, see, look, they're so disabled. They're so limited because they need all of these things. But what if we looked at supports a different way? So what if we really looked at supports and how they're able to expand a person's ability to participate and contribute? And last night, again, Florian described lots of different ways that he has supports that he uses at work, and certainly that he will when he's moving into his apartment. So that shouldn't be seen as a problem, that, oh, that's so different because another, you know, young man doesn't need that. That actually shows you, wow, he can participate and contribute a lot if we provide these supports. So why, if a child needs a visual or a tactile checklist to complete a job, we say, oh, they can't do that unless they've got help. That help, they need to have that. Instead, it should be like, wow, if we have a checklist for this child, they can do this independently. So supports have to be seen as something that's a positive. And we also can't forget that all of us rely on them. This presentation wouldn't be happening now if it hadn't been for that man up in the booth that helped David and I at the last minute, and Claudia, figure out how to add slides to this and videos. So we all rely on supports in our life. And we really can't use the type and the intensity of supports as just another reason of something that's wrong with the person. Oh, I did it again. I need to keep my hand up there. Okay, now I'm coming up to one of my very favorite slides ever, okay? So I was at the CHARGE conference in Scottsdale in 2013, and I was going through the poster session, so it was a room full of all these posters like you see around the room, and they were pretty and colorful and had lots of research and citations. And then I came across this one, and it just said Jacob Can, and it was about Tim and Nancy's son Jacob. And it's this list, and you can't read it that easily from there, but it just lists all the things that Jacob can do. And I'll just read a few to you. At the grocery store, he can take items off the shelf, push the cart, take you to the carpeting aisle. He must love carpeting. Put items on the checkout, uses cane, open doors. Okay, there's a lot of things he can do at the store. I haven't told you that he can shop independently, but there's a lot of things he can do. He can zip his coat, he can hang up his coat in the closet, he can fold, clean laundry, and put his clothes away with help. He can clean his bedroom if you prompt him or remind him. He can vacuum with the tap of his elbow. That's a really cool skill. He can also shut cupboards with a spoon. One of my favorites is that he can get in and out of his hot tub independently. That's very nice. This shows you a lot about the quality of Jacob's life. He can turn the bathtub water on and off with his foot. He can drain the tub, cover himself up at bedtime. He can give you a high five. He can be independent. So I took this picture. I went up to Tim and Nancy and said, can I please post this on our work Facebook page? This is amazing. Can I use this in my presentations? And so again, let's take this two views of Jacob. And you heard a little bit about Jacob yesterday from David. Jacob is one of the more complex children you might meet with CHARGE. Okay, so if you look, let's first look at actually the right side, the red side. What Jacob can't do, he can't drive a car. And how old is he? He's 27, okay, so he still can't drive a car. He can't speak, he's deafblind. He can't wash his hands or brush his teeth independently. He can't read a recipe. He cannot cook a meal. He can't grocery shop, wash dishes, or do laundry independently. He rips paper or shreds paper, so we need to make sure he doesn't have paper. And he can't live alone. So that would be one list. That's not the list that I saw in the poster session, but that's how a lot of people, when they meet Jacob, and if they don't know anything about Jacob, what you might see or think. And as his educators, it would be very bad for Jacob if that's what they saw and that's all they worked on. Instead, you can look at what he can do. So he can ride a bike and he can buckle a seatbelt. He uses sign language and picture symbols to communicate. So even though he can't speak, he can communicate. He puts his glasses and cochlear on. He can wash his hands and brush his teeth if you give him some help. He can push a grocery cart and put items on the checkout stand. He can shred paper. This could be, this could be a good thing. There could be lots of different ways that could be needed. This could even be an into a job. He can put away clean dishes. He can put dirty clothes in the washer, wet clothes in the dryer, and he can choose to use his hot tub and get in and out of it independently. So the question I have for you is, which list would be more helpful in helping Jacob live a life that would be more fulfilling and bring him more happiness? that's what the focus should really be on. You have to look at a kid or a young adult. You have to look at them and say, you have to look at those two different lists and which one is going to really be more helpful. And that's all we're trying to express to you today, is that this assessment process should be something that helps you make a plan for the child that is going to help them and help their family. And David, the same thing has happened that happened in Chicago. So I'm going to just do this slide but not go into detail, because I want you to get back up here and have a little time for the video, okay? You think? Oh, I guess I do. It's really only 10 o'clock. Okay, I'm going to go pick it up a little bit, but not my speed, interpreters and, yeah. Not my speed, but just I'm going to go over things. And are you all doing well? I know you've been sitting for an hour. If you need to stand up and stretch, I don't care, or walk around the back, okay? I won't feel bad, or jump or something. And it's warm in here, and yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah, we're going to take a little brain break here, because I've just been. Okay, capacity building assessment practices. So I've been talking a lot about this mindset and a different perspective to take at, but I do want you to actually walk away today with some ideas about what could be some things you could do while you're assessing the children that would be helpful. So these are the 4 areas I want to touch on: language use, that view of supports, interpretation in terms of what your the reciprocal engagement that you have with the child and the respect that you show when you're assessing the child, and then the idea of holding high expectations. So in particular, these are practices that I think could be helpful for you. The first one to remember is just language use. So language is very, very powerful, and both in written form and spoken form. And so you really have to think about this in 2 important contexts. First, how you're describing or talking about the child when you're collaborating with the other educators on the team, because again, you're sitting in this room and getting this information, or you might read some of these articles or other articles that are more focused on a child-guided assessment approach, but there might be other people on the team, as David talked about, who absolutely will never put on those rose-colored glasses and are always going to be focused on the deficit. So you could really influence some of those other people by the language you use. And the other thing that I think you have to be very, very careful about the language is when you're sitting in meetings with families. And you really have to think about how powerful that language could be if you say, oh no, he can't do that. Or she's not able to do that yet. She's not ready. Or I think he has to be at this school, because so you have to really think about your language when you're interacting with families. And I think it will really help your relationships with your families in terms of the collaboration that you have and just the positive relationship, if they can really see that you recognize the potential and capacity of their child. I don't think there's anything that goes farther with a parent is when they have a teacher demonstrate through their language and through their actions and the things that they do that they see a lot of potential for their child, and they think that their child has a positive future in front of them. So your words will really paint that picture of whether you see that child as having capacity or whether you're focusing on deficits. And if you focus on the deficits, it's really just extending this view that we already have in society about disability. We have a lot of views about limitations and barriers, and we focus it not on society's barriers, which is really what it is. There's architectural barriers because people can't get around, but there's also a lot of attitudinal barriers that really actually make a person more disabled than they are. So if you're going to keep focusing on the child's limitations and their deficits, you're just extending that view, and I don't think that is helpful at all for the team or for your planning. Using person-first language, so again, not just describing a kid as that charge kid, but that kid is Jonas, and this is who he is, and strength-based descriptions, focusing on what are the things that child can do versus listing a label and then listing all the things that the child cannot do. You want to focus a lot on their abilities and interests and support needs. And the last tip I give teachers is just try to avoid that expert voice, especially again with families. You really want to use a voice that's going to invite people to want to collaborate with you and discuss and brainstorm together. And if people think that you're just that expert, you might not be able to get that dialogue going. So, and I'm going to tell you some specific ways that you can kind of, things you could say instead of using that voice. So view of supports, I talked about this earlier. Again, not forgetting we all rely on support. And we also have to move towards recognizing that this is natural. Just like disability is natural, it's something that exists. The need for supports is a natural thing. It's not an indication that something is wrong with that child. And the supports that you think about, again, have to be individualized. So it shouldn't be, we use this kind of picture communication system in class for a calendar, and this is what I use in class for every child, if that child needs an object calendar, or if that child also needs signed communication. So it has to be individualized, and the support should allow the person to have control. So the support should allow the person to say, yes, no, I like this, or no, thank you, or I'm finished. Make choices. You want the support to be able to help them to participate as much as possible. It needs to be meaningful so that they can be part of things and not just a token thing of setting up a switch that if they hit it, one word comes out, but it doesn't have any meaning for that child. And really thinking about the ways that that support is going to help them to contribute to what's happening in the class or in the group that they're part of or with their family and community. And definitely sharing the supports that you're using in class with the family. The second part of thinking about supports is that really the child and the family need to be part of this discussion. So again, it's kind of stepping out of that role of us as educators, as the expert, and talking to the family like, does this make sense to you? And they might tell you that, oh, you know, we've tried that already and it didn't work. Or we do something very much like that at home, and this is how we do it. And it might be something that you could connect to what you're doing at school. So again, not having a standardized support. We always use this with this kind of kid in our class, so here's your support. Really thinking about what fits for the kid. Thinking about natural support. So again, when I talked about all of us relying on supports, many of us, if I asked you to list the people in your lives that provide support to you, it's not people that are paid in your life to provide that support. It's people in your family, or it's your friends, or it's work colleagues. So we need to be thinking about that with the kids that we work with too. How can we develop those natural supports? So how can we teach siblings and teach peers ways that they could help that child? How can we use routines? So again, I think last night we heard from Florian, and we certainly heard examples from the speakers yesterday. If you can have a particular routine in place, a child can learn something very quickly, and all of a sudden they don't need extra support. But if you change the way that you do an activity every time, then the child's going to get anxious. They're not going to be able to do that without someone helping them through. So regular routines. Thinking about just a good seating arrangement can just be a simple way to make sure that the child can participate more. And now there's so much support through assistive technology, and just as simple as assistive technology that you can find on the phone that you pull out of your pocket or your purse. So there can be a lot of great ways to have a very natural supports that are very typical to what other people use. You have to remember that supports are going to change over a child's life. So as they develop skills, it doesn't mean they don't need supports anymore, but you're changing the supports. And then you always want to make sure that those supports are really enhancing that child's competency, showing what they can do, but also enhancing their dignity. So next I wanted to talk about reciprocity and respect. And the key thing here is that you can say lots of things to people, and you can tell people things, but they're actually going to learn more by watching what you do, right? So you have to really think about when you're interacting with a child during the assessment process, what that's showing other people around you. And I think, and David and I have always done this when we've worked with children and gone in and assessed either in the home or in the classroom, we've always wanted the other either family members or educational team members to be there with us. It's not like we go over and like pull the child to a separate desk or to a separate room and sit there with our notebook and pen. It's really about engaging people in this dialogue and finding things out. So How you respond to the child will tell people a lot. So if you are asked to go in, or if you're working with a child and they're a child that's showing a lot of anxiety in their behavior, or a lot of defiance or resistance, how you're responding in those difficult situations is going to help people a lot. So if you can remain very calm, and if you can sit and provide information and strategies that will be helpful to the team, they'll learn more from that than you handing them an article or you giving them notes from a lecture. It's important as you're watching the child and observing that you're really pointing out, and again, this could be very subtle and small, so this is why we talked a lot about the observation techniques, is thinking about their strengths, what strengths they're showing and what attempts they're making and what interests they're showing. And then you really want to remain very, very calm and respectful and supportive in your interactions. So again, I talked about how, this is very important when you're thinking about children who don't communicate in a typical way, so they might not be nonverbal, or they might be using their behavior to communicate. You really have to acknowledge messages that you see. So again, team members might not recognize, they might have called you in because they want you to help with the behavior without recognizing that the behavior is all communication. We've had a lot of luck asking I wonder questions. So again, that's moving away from that expert idea, but I wonder why he's doing this. Or do you think if you sat her in a seat and you actually put a block under her feet so her feet weren't dangling, that she'd be able to control her body a little bit more? So asking I wonder questions, and again, pointing out how the child's communicating and participating, ways that you think that they could do that. I have a few examples. And then I'm almost done. So an example might be, a teacher might be frustrated because they can't figure out how a child could participate in an art project because they have different problems with their motor skills and regulating their behavior and sitting upright, but they might be just missing a very small thing, that the little girl is looking up and smiling. So look, Sarah's looking up at you and smiling. I think she's enjoying this. So they might not be picking that up, that the child's saying, I like this is fun, but it's something that's very small that's important. Or Juan's jumping up and down in the cafeteria line, and you could just state, because you don't know, you've just, if you haven't spent a lot of time with the child, you might say, I wonder if being so close to the other students and waiting in line is making him anxious. It's not enough to just say he's anxious all the time, but start, I wonder, is this why? And you might not know, but if you ask other people that know the child better, you might be able to start this dialogue. Did you notice that Audrey laid down on her back and crossed her leg, as we saw yesterday from so many kids in David's pictures? Once you gave her that book, that's really smart that she knows what she needs. So that's another important part of this interpretation, that you're pointing out what a child might be doing that's adaptive and functional for them, and pointing out that that's actually showing a lot of their intelligence. And then the last one is just an example of ways that you could suggest to people a way that someone could participate. So I imagine if Andres had his lines simplified and highlighted in the script and could practice them with a peer partner, then he could easily participate in Reader's Theater. Versus many times I hear from team members or families, well, they told me he can't be in that play, or he can't be up on the stage because he can't do it. But you have to stop and think about, well, how could he do it? What supports would help? And then the last slide is just about hold high expectations, and I think that you've seen that through the whole morning so far, that we do that. So these are just some suggestions for that. And the last one that I just wanted to point out is, I think the strongest one that can really help is using a person-centered planning approach and involving the family. So really thinking a lot about what the future will look like. And I'm going to quickly hand it over to David.
There are two reasons I don't co-present with other people. One is that I'm very disorganized. So if it's only me, I can just be disorganized and it isn't a problem. But as Julie has discovered, if I'm disorganized, it gives her a problem as well. And the other reason I don't do it is I'm much more anxious about this than I was yesterday, because if it goes wrong, I've disappointed Julie, and if I disappoint myself, I do that all the time, so it's a way of life. So I just have a few things to say in closing, and then we will look at some video, I hope. So everything we've said so far is unusual. In this room, it's probably okay and it's fairly normal, and I hope you agree that we have the right attitude and the right idea. But when you leave this room and go back into the real world, this approach is very unusual and very new and very strange, and people will not understand it. And that is an important thing to remember. Now Google is telling me there's another update. It's so kind of them. Why is it telling me but not Julie? Because it knows I hate them, I think. And they do have ways of doing that, don't they? Through Facebook and your emails and things. I've noticed when I saw a foot doctor, this is not about assessment, but I went to a foot doctor. I have a thing called a bunion on my foot. And I wrote an email to someone and said I'd been to the foot doctor. And the next morning, all the advertisements on my Google Mail were for foot doctors. It was very strange. So I'm being targeted here. So our approach pretty obviously is positive. That's come across, I hope, very strongly. It looks at positive skills and achievements. And then thinking about the great guru Jan van Dijk from the Netherlands, it looks at learning styles. We're less concerned with the goal than the way the child travels to the goal. What is their learning style? Are they a visual learner, a tactile learner? Do they need movement to learn? Are they a language-based listening learner? And they will be different types of learner in different situations or at different times. So we need to get to know them in terms of what is the right learning style at the moment for this student. And that will vary. It looks at preferences and interests, and Julie gave some nice examples of those. It looks at the whole child, and that's important. If I'm asked to assess a child's vision, I don't only look at the eyes, I look at the whole child. How do you know that the child can see the light when it comes on? Well, maybe their eyes will move, maybe they will look at the light, but maybe their fingers will move. The eyes don't move, but the fingers move, or the breathing will change, or the feet will move. There are all sorts of ways that children behave that give us an idea what's working and what's not working. And we need to be whole child people all the time, because once you ignore the whole child, things start to go wrong and you don't understand properly. Julie also talked about crediting the child with intelligence. I think every photograph I showed yesterday was a demonstration of intelligence in the children. That's why it's so important as a starting point. The goal of assessment for us is to improve our understanding of the child. To me, assessing a child is getting to know the child. That's how I see it. Just as if I meet you, I'm assessing you, because I'm saying, where did you come from? Are you a teacher? Oh, you're a parent. How old is your child? Oh, you're from France, and so on and so on. To me, that's no different. I'm not only focusing on difficulties and the needs that you have, I'm filling in a whole picture about who you are. And that is the most effective way of approaching a child with charge syndrome if you have an assessment function. We're trying to build a positive relationship with the child. I don't want to fight with children unless they put me in a position where I have no choice. And they don't usually put me in that position because I don't allow that position to develop. And we all go into schools where we see these fights and these struggles and these battles. And in most cases, they are not necessary. but the change has to come from us, not from the child. If we want to change the child, we have to change ourselves in those cases. Assessment is a way of trying to help to know what to teach and how best to teach it. And I think most teachers are aware of this, even if they're not doing it effectively. And it seeks to give us a clear focus to measure progress. I'm going to skip some slides if I can manage it, because we're running out of time. And I want to go on to, I don't know if this won't work. I have to put my reading glasses on. PowerPoint changed its design about 3 years ago, and it wasn't an improvement. And I'm now demonstrating that it wasn't an improvement. It worked. I talked yesterday about difficulties with the brain and the body not being connected effectively. And I talk in the last few years that in CHARGE syndrome, people ask a lot about communication and language. It's a big problem. It's a big concern for people. They want to know, should we speak? Should we sign? Should we use pictures? Should we hide the pictures? Should we never sign or use gestures, and so on and so on? I don't know. But I say, first of all, how does this child communicate with their own body? Because that will decide everything else. Communication and language with other people will depend on whether their brain is communicating with their body or not. If it's not communicating effectively, that will take priority over social interaction with other people, and we see this all the time. So first, in every situation, the child needs to learn how to communicate with their own body. Where is my body? What is it doing? What do I need to do to make my body work effectively, safely is important. Then communication with the immediate environment. Once your brain knows what your body is doing, how does it interact with the environment? And then how can we extend this into the wider world so that it works effectively? And I will stop there because we're going to try and show you some video to finish, and Julie will make some points. I hope. I never use video because it terrifies me. But Julie is younger and more positive. So I will cross my fingers and hope.
So David and I both wear rose-colored glasses, but I think when David sees that image, yeah, or when you see that image of the glass, David sometimes actually says it's half empty. But not about kids, but he'll say it about technology, So last year we had this all set up. So this is the same slide, yeah. We had this all set up to show in Chicago, and then it didn't work. And then this morning, we tried it in, oh, did you put the new, oh, here, okay. We tried it in San Francisco, and it worked perfectly, and then we tried it this morning, and it wouldn't work. But then with Claudia's help and the technology person up there, we figured it out. Okay, so now I'm going to, so this is an adorable little boy with CHARGE syndrome. He goes to a preschool in Berkeley, California. It's the children it's a deaf, hard of hearing preschool. Many of the children at the school are only deaf, but there are probably in each class 3 or 4 children who are deaf with additional disabilities. Paul is he's responsive to signed communication that others use, but he's not using a lot of it himself yet. At this point, this video was taken a year ago, and at this point he was just starting to use a walker. So he was just starting to get around more on 2 feet, on 2 points. And he's sitting here with his intervener. And what I want you to pay attention to is And David didn't quite show these slides, but how many people in the room have read some of David's things about Follow the Child? Can you put your hands up so I know? Okay. David just asks 4 questions. It's how do you feel? So figuring out where the child's at in terms of their arousal and emotional state. What do you like? So what are the child's interests? What do you want? So how are you communicating and showing what you want and how are people responding to that? And what do you do? So remember, that's not what can you do, which is more of a hard kind of test assessment kind of question, but what do you do? So what do you do? And that's going to tell me where to start from. So pay attention to those 4 questions, but also think about that communication, how Paul is communicating with his own body, how he's communicating with the environment, immediate environment right in front of him, the materials, and then what you notice in terms of his communication with the other person. So pay attention to Paul, but also pay attention to the things that this intervener is doing, which I think she's doing a really good job of following the child and not really directing the activity as much as letting it happen. So here we go, fingers crossed.
Yes, there you go for coloring with me. Where'd the marker go? Or the coloring? There you go.
Okay, so that's just introducing him to the drawing. The activity is just starting, and he really was and still continues to be a child that doesn't come up and initiate a lot of activity with other people. He can be a bit of a solitary player. I personally don't think that he's a kid that doesn't like to be around other people. He's always watching other people, and I've seen him playing with his cousins, he spends a lot of time with, and with those kids I see a lot more engaged interaction. So I think for him it has a lot to do with people he knows and being ready, but he likes to watch things, okay? So now the next, and you saw a lot of things that he was doing with his body, yes? The rocking back and forth, the holding his head, banging on the wall. Okay, so this is, again, getting him really ready for this activity. And what I liked about what she did is she never grabbed his hand, told him, this is how we draw, let's make the letter P. She's just having fun.
Here we go. I got Miss Emily. Okay.
Okay, so follow the child. So, and he was making the rhythm, right? And so now it's not just about my body, and he's no longer doing the rocking and holding his head, but he's doing it now with the materials around him, with the board. And she's just following. She's not saying, let's do this faster. She's not trying to put the pen in his hand. She's just, okay, this is what you want to do. I wanted to color, but you want to bang on the board. Okay. And you can learn a lot about Paul if you're paying attention to what he's doing. It's not going to be as helpful to write down in your notebook, refuses to hold the crayon. But people do.
I will show her. Yellow? You try yellow? Ooh. There we go. Good. Want to try a different color? Oh, that was so good.
Isn't he adorable? Oh my gosh. So again, so what did you notice? He stopped banging and he started drawing like her, okay? and then he stopped, and now he has to start to rock again and move around again. So he's done with that, and she brilliantly doesn't say, oh, no, 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 we're not done. Stay right here. I'll hold you. She just lets him kind of regulate himself back. She saw an opportunity for communication. She said, oh, are you picking another color? You know, so she didn't say like, oh, you're stopped, you're done. No, she's still keeping him engaged. It was just brilliant. And I wasn't here to see this. This was, the classroom teacher saw this occurring. She videotaped it on her phone and sent it to me and the mom and said, this is follow the child, right? And we're like, oh, yeah. Okay, and then here's the finale.
Okay.
Oh my God, look, oh my God, look, Jessica.
Yay! Oh, Bonnie, this is so good. Yay! Is it my turn now? My turn? Oh, thank you. Then I go?
Silly.
You're so good.
So, aren't you glad the video worked? That was a good ending. And the other thing I didn't tell you about him is before, when I saw him, and we've known him for a long time, but when I saw him in class, probably 2 months before this, the big problem was, is they said, why do you think he does this, Julie? He would just get anything he could off a table, pick it up and throw it. That was just his thing. Pick it up, drop, throw. He'd go up to a basket, wouldn't want to play with the things in it, just take it out and throw it. And that was just, I said, I don't know why he does that, except that he likes to do it, and this is how he's using the material now. So he still was doing that a bit at the end, dropping the crayon, but the fact that he got from just taking things and dropping them, and that they kind of guided him and shaped it into something that was just more typical in a preschool and expected that he could learn. You could see that they presumed a lot of competence. They you know, and knew that he wanted to engage with them. It was beautiful. So, yeah, and that by the end, you see all this communication now with the wider world. He holds up the crayon at the end right to the person taking the picture. Like he's absolutely like, look, see what I did. So he was able to move from communicating with his own body to just the materials around him to the people in the environment. So, yes, we have a little break now, and it was wonderful to spend the early part of the morning with you. Thank you. And we're around the rest of the conference. Thank you. We did it.